Hi, we're going to talk about how to crush biochemistry, either at the college level or the graduate school, medical school level. Probably the most useful thing you're going to get out of this talk is this idea of how to make a good mnemonic. Everybody's heard of making mnemonics, but there's ways to make them really well. I'll just show you a couple of books I wrote. I wrote a book called The Medical Student's Guide to Top Board Scores. When I was in medical school, I won an award first in my class, and I had like one of the highest biochemistry, maybe the highest biochemistry score in medical school boards in the whole United States. And I've been interested in cognitive optimization, and really at the highest competitive levels from Stanford onwards. And I wrote a book on, straight A Stanford on to Harvard about how to become a great student at the college, graduate school level. I studied the cognitive development in kids as I had my own kids, and later on I wrote a How to Raise IQ book. So I've been interested in this for a long time. So some of the things I'm going to say, they might surprise you, but I'm not talking about getting an A in a junior college class that's really easy. I'm talking about A++ level work in a really advanced competitive academic environment. So some of these things are philosophical. The reason for philosophical stuff is you have to get your motivation correct, your sense of purpose, in order to optimize your performance. And I can tell you, I was in med school at the time, and I had a friend of mine who was in a different grad school, but he said to me one day, Saturday was a busy day, I studied 5 hours. And I was thinking to myself, what a wimp, 5 hours, that's nothing, okay? And basically, for a guy who doesn't want to study, 5 hours of studying is a lot of work. But for somebody who really wants to learn, 5 hours is nothing. You're just getting warmed up. So anyways, with studying. So this, by the way, is a mnemonic that represents glycolysis, which is the most important of all the biochemistry cycles. All right, so first of all, in terms of getting your psychology correct, is biochemistry important? Yes, if you want to be a doctor, it's important. It's the most difficult school most difficult subject in medical school. And if you're serious about the biological sciences, in my opinion, especially when I was a young guy, the way I saw it was biochemistry is the language of God that he uses to write the book of life, okay? And basically, if I ever want to become a great doctor or a great scientist, I need to learn this stuff well. And when you think that way, it's important. You're more happy to study a long time. My father one time said to me too, ever since the beginning of recorded history, more than 95% of persons have been, peasants and serfs, just trying to grow some food out of the land with manual labor, illiterate. So you're lucky to be able to have the opportunity to study. Okay, does God exist? We don't need to get into all this stuff philosophically, but I would basically say if you've looked at the arguments in the science on the origin of the universe, the origin of life, the origin of complexity in living creatures, the origin of species, look at the Big Bang, the Doppler shift, Hubble and all that. It's pretty good that the universe had a beginning, therefore a beginner, therefore an unmoved mover. And he probably was a theistic type rather than a deistic type because it was too hot in the time of the Big Bang at the origin of the universe. He had to come back later and make life. And based on the pattern of life, he had to come back several times. That's what the Cambrian suggests, and the lack of transitional forms. So for what it's been said, God was a good creator, not so great of a manager. But basically, for what that's worth, for lining yourself up for great achievement, lots of the great achievers, they've sort of been religious. They have to have something that inspires you to do extra effort, to care about your subject, to want to be great at something. You have to have that, If you don't have that, you're not going to be great. If you want to be great, lots of these great achievers were totally sort of obsessed with their task. And some of them were very religious, Bach, Michelangelo, Newton, Dostoevsky. And almost like you're making a deal with God. Please help me to learn and understand this material, and I promise I will help other people as much as I can. That type of psychology, it positions you to study and be excellent at school. And, like I can remember guys would want to go get drunk, and I would say no. I would feel sorry for them because I'd be like, I'm on my path to becoming a great doctor and a great scientist. I don't want to be drinking alcohol. I don't want to do stupid stuff. I don't want to go to a rock concert, listen to loud music, make myself deaf. I'm not interested in that crap. I'm interested in becoming great at what I'm doing. And so that personal philosophy was really helpful for academic achievement. Okay, so now we're going to start talking about some of the scientific things I think that'll really help you. First one is you got to pre-read. Biochemistry is a complicated subject, most difficult subject in med school, and if you just walk into class without having prepared it all, you'd be overwhelmed very quickly. I remember when I first started out in biochem, I would barely catch about 15% of what the teacher was saying. The rest of the stuff I'd have to spend the whole week trying to make it up and figure it out. But once I started to pre-read, I would try to read a couple hours before a biochemistry lecture. Then I would really have the vocabulary so I can make all the abbreviations easily with notes. And I would get the big picture, and I really made it my goal to try to turn the teacher's lecture into a review session rather than the beginning of learning. That made a big improvement in my ability to comprehend and follow biochemistry. Second thing is you always want to go to class. Class is like an emotional event, and you get psyched up for class, can't wait to hear this lecture, can't wait to see how much I can understand and get as much I kept making it my goal. Get 70% of everything during the class, 80%, 90%, 95%. There's always a little bit that'll get by you, but then what you do is you sit down later that evening or the next day, leave a little bit of blank space in your notes, and it's like you hear the teacher's voice in your head, oh yeah, and you just add in the details that you weren't able to write fast enough. I like to write notes by hand. I think that's better than typing. Typing's fast, but you lose something with the typing, and you can't have as much free-form ability to make arrows and abbreviations. Okay, what else? Sit in front of the class like a goalie. I would sit in front of the class like a goalie and try not to let the teacher get anything past me. And I used to be real intimidated by biochemistry professors when I started out. You know, oh, this guy knows so much, he's so smart, and I'd be overwhelmed. But afterwards, I kind of would have more of a competitive attitude. I'd be like, ah, yeah, this guy, you know, he's a PhD because he couldn't get into med school. He's not that smart. He's not going to get anything past me. He's not going to overwhelm me. He's the past, I'm the future. I'd kind of have this competitive, intense attitude, get psyched up for biochemistry class. And it helped, you know, for what it's worth. It sounds almost a little silly looking back now after all these years, but at the time, I remember biochemistry class was a big deal to me. I was excited about it, and that helped me to memorize it. When something's important to you, you remember it better. And you think about it. When you think about it in your mind, you turn around the material in your mind, you then develop a deeper understanding. Okay, now mnemonics. I've seen a lot of biochemistry lectures online. And you know, most of them are pretty generic. And a lot of the mnemonics that they make, they're too long. They like use a word to represent another word. It's usually much better to use what's called an acronym and just have one letter or one symbol to represent something. What I would do is I would take like about 3 or 4 biochemistry books and I'd put them out on the table and I would sit there and I'd look at the biochemistry cycle, study it a bit, and I would ask myself, what is the irreducible minimum? What is the irreducible minimum from which all of this can be derived? And for glycolysis, it's obviously the phosphates. So for glycolysis, I would just number the phosphates, and that's the trick I use to remember glycolysis. Each cycle will have some characteristic feature. You also want to figure out what is it that you need to know for your particular class. For example, if you're a pre-med student, or let's say a first-year medical student, the main thing they're going to ask you about is the regulation of glycolysis. You know, what happens when glucose is brought into the cell? What is the main regulatory step, like phosphofructokinase, that sort of thing. So make sure you know what you're expected to know based on what your teacher says and your level that you're studying it at. Get those practice question books, do practice questions. That's what's on a test, is practice questions. So you got to be good at answering questions. The other thing you want to do is a walk and talk. So a walk and talk means you close the book, you get up, and you walk around and you start talking to yourself out loud. A good thing to do is whenever you take a study break, go to the bathroom, just sit there and talk to yourself in the bathroom and start saying it back to yourself. Say this mnemonic to yourself, 666, 13, 1332, PPAL. Okay, so what does that mean? When you look at glycolysis, we'll just briefly go through this, not for the purpose of really going through glycolysis to study glycolysis right now, but just to show you how a mnemonic works. I organized the first number, 666, because that's more memorable. I could have put the 1 in front, but this is more memorable. It's like the devil's number, 666, okay? And so that's where the phosphates are. Glucose comes into the cell, gets phosphorylated to trap it into the cell. You put the big bulky phosphate on there with a negative charge, so that's glucose 6-phosphate. Then you got to isomerase it, right? You're going to move the carbonyl group from being glucoaldehyde, it's an aldehyde, to being fructone, it's a ketone, okay? So then you got fructose 6-phosphate, okay? Then you're going to stick another fructose on there at the phosphofructokinase stage, and you're going to have fructose 6-1-phosphate. I say it in that order because it reminds me of the mnemonic. Then the asterisk is for DHEP. So it's good to have a book of glycolysis cycle out in front of yourself right now as I say this, but you can see how concise this mnemonic is, okay? The asterisk represents DHAP because there's no number on DHAP for the location of its phosphate. Then you got 3-phosphoglyceraldehyde, and I like to write them out in the Fisher projection. Fisher is like a fishing line, meaning that it's straight in comparison with a Hayworth being like a ring. And if I remember that, glucoaldehyde is an aldehyde, fructone is a ketone, and then 3-phosphoglyceraldehyde as an aldehyde reminds me of glucose. That ends up being really useful for understanding glucose. Then the next thing is you get inorganic phosphate added to it to make 1,3-bisphosphoglycerate. From here on out, they're all ATEs, 8s, which means deprotonated carboxylic acid. So if you have a carboxylic acid, it would be called acid if it was a protonated carboxylic acid. Once you deprotonate it, it becomes ATE, carboxylate. Okay, so anyways, this is the 1,3-bisphosphoglycerate, then 3-phosphoglycerate, 2-phosphoglycerate, and then you're going to have it go to phospholinopyruvate, pyruvate, and then if it's aerobic, it'll go to acetyl-CoA, anaerobic, it'll go to lactate. And when you do that, the next thing you want to do is you want to walk and talk, just say it yourself. Okay, I remember 6. You got to trap glucose in the cell. Try to understand stuff, because when you understand stuff, it's easy to memorize. Trap it in the cell with a phosphorylation, glucose-6-phosphate. Okay, then I got to isomerize it. I got to shift that carbonyl group over so I can stick a phosphate on the other end, make a symmetric molecule eventually, fructose 1,6-phosphate, that can then be split for the 3-carbon phase of glycolysis in the second part. So then I go from fructose-6-phosphate to fructose-6,1-phosphate. Then I got the aldolase reaction. I split it into DHAP and into 3-phosphoglyceraldehyde, right? And then you know you're going to run down. The way you can remember these numbers too, I remember 13 is a bad luck number. That's easy to remember. And then I remember 32 for O.J. Simpson. He was a great running back when I was a young guy, and he had the, the whole crazy story about the other stuff with O.J. Simpson. But anyways, it's easy to remember 32. That was his number, okay? And then PayPal sounds a lot like an internet company. I can just remember that. And that's pretty easy to remember for what happens, and I make it an extension. So the whole thing's like a phone number. But the point being is, when you walk around and talk and you say it yourself, it's a great thing to do for school. And here's why. I'm not worried about recognizing what's on the test in some Scantron test. I could write the whole thing down from memory. And what you're doing with a good mnemonic is you're expanding your working memory. That way you can play around with this stuff in your head. And once you have it memorized, what is the names of all the substrates, it becomes very easy then to remember the enzymes, because the enzymes are based on the names of the substrates. And once you know the names of the enzymes, and you know their steps and their relevance, and you can say them all to yourself, you're confident walking into a test. Because you're confident, you're less stressed, you got more blood flow to your frontal lobes, you perform better on the test. And then you can memorize the regulatory steps. So I just walk around and say it to myself. Glucose, glucose-6-phosphate, fructose-6-phosphate, fructose-6,1-phosphate, DHAP, 3-phosphoglyceraldehyde, 1,3-phosphoglycerate, bisphosphoglycerate, and then remind myself again, 3-phosphoglycerate, 2-phosphoglycerate, and then PPAL, okay, which is phospholinopyruvate, pyruvate, acetyl-CoA, and lactate. So anyways, you get the point. Do it that way, and you'll have better results with your biochem classes. So that's it.